34. Good Rules to Study Solar Returns by Ciro Discepolo. What you're about to read or study is not intended to be an extension of the Bible, but simply a set of rules emerging from my experience. They should be taken as a whole for verification, and then either accepted or rejected based on the results they yield. In my opinion, they were quite remarkably so, but I do not wish to influence you excessively. I only want you to test them. If by using them you find that they help you make highly reliable predictions, far more reliable than other methods taught by other masters, then let me know your impressions. My email is ciro.discepolo@gmail.com. and my website is www.cirodiscepolo.it. What I ask, however, is that you take them as a block. If you truly intend to experiment with them, you must use them as a comprehensive whole without making an arbitrary selection. The 34 rules are as follows. The 20 days before and the 20 days after a birthday are extremely important, both positively and negatively. Often the most significant events of the entire year occur during these days. Note 1. 2. The birthday itself is a truly special day when extraordinary events can occur. Giacomo Casanova, who was a careful transcriber of his life's events, stated in his memoirs that 7 times during his life, his birthday coincided with extraordinary events, positive or negative, that radically changed the course of his existence, such as escaping from prison or becoming a millionaire. I do not know why this is. I cannot say why the birthday is so special, and even if I have some ideas on the matter, I refrain from stating them because I'm not certain. Nevertheless, even if I cannot provide a theoretical explanation, I limit myself to observing that it works. From today on, try listening to the news carefully, noting this detail, or read the newspapers following this type of news, and you will see it recurs constantly. The Armenian mobster arrested in a luxury hotel on his birthday, the assassin of Judge Giovanni Falcone arrested on the birthday of his victim, the soccer player scoring the decisive goal on his day of birth, and so on. Thousands of examples could be cited. If several birthdays occur close together within the subject's family, those days become explosive, true fuses, and even more events tend to concentrate around them. Note 2. 4. Remember that if the ascendant, a stellium, or the solar return sun falls in the 1st, 6th, or 12th house, with almost no difference between them, the year is a candidate for being extremely heavy, fatal, dangerous, and negative across the board, not just specifically for health, work, or relationships. In almost all cases, it will be a black year, a year you will remember for many years to come, a year to forget. I realize that by saying this, I end up emphasizing this value enormously, but that is exactly what I intend to do. In my opinion, no author has ever spoken with these exclamation points, whereas I believe it is right not only to place precise exclamation points among one's rules, but to place them exactly here and nowhere else. Some have spoken of the 12th house somewhat negatively, but no one, I believe, before me has demonized it so much, nor has anyone so criminalized the 6th and 1st houses. But try following this rule and let me know. When these houses are intercepted, one can have trouble in all directions. In romantic life, with health, with the law, with money, in relation to a loss, and so forth. Note 3. 5. Everything said in the previous paragraph also applies to Mars in the 12th, 6th, or 1st house of a solar or lunar return. This position alone is capable of ruining a year that promised to be very positive due to other transit elements or the solar lunar return itself. In examining the solar return, I recommend paying attention only to a few but certain elements. A. Where the solar return ascendant falls relative to the natal houses. B. Where a solar return stellium falls relative to the solar return houses. C. Where the solar return sun falls relative to the solar return houses. D. Where the malefics, especially Mars, fall relative to the solar return houses. E. Subsequently, and only then, the other planetary positions in the houses. I strongly advise against taking other elements into account, such as whether a planet is retrograde or whether it forms a good or bad aspect, because such elements do not have zero value, but a very low value, on the order of a decimal fraction compared to the whole numbers of the positions listed above. For example, Mars in the 12th house in the solar return of a 60-year-old will always be extremely dangerous, regardless of whether it is retrograde and regardless of whether it is afflicted in exile, in fall, or in any other condition. The solar return is a window of exceptional clarity on the 12 months it spans, but one must avoid the error of trying to read it as if it were a natal chart, looking at dispositors, derived houses, and so on. All this, far from bringing clarity, only serves to mask the meanings that are already crystal clear. The 7th house almost always concerns legal papers, trouble with the law, possible conflicts with justice, wars of all kinds, various tensions, strong arguments, disagreements with the partner, or even separations. Declared enmities, even attacks such as being kneecapped, or damage to one's property, for example, due to mafia intimidation. Jupiter and the Sun, both in transit and in the solar return in the 2nd, 7th, and 8th houses, act like a bistable oscillator in the sense that they tend to invert the pre-existing situation by 180 degrees. If there is calm, they bring storms. If there is war, they help restore peace. Read more about this in the specific paragraphs, but keep this rule in high consideration to avoid completely miscalculating an astral situation. Note 4. 2nd and 8th house values indicate in most cases large outflows of money, true hemorrhages of cash, and much less frequently inflows of money. The 11th house is often related to death and mourning, much more so than the 8th house, where death is only secondary to the main theme, which is money in 90% of cases, and 8th house intercepted in the solar return, and also in transits, speaks of economic problems and not death. Even today, many years after this discovery, I wonder how it is possible that no colleague noticed this before me. It is a reality so transparent that only a blind person or a representative of PSYCAP, the sworn enemies of astrology, EDI, could fail to notice. Try examining 20 deaths that have occurred to you or your friends, and you will find the infallibility of this rule. Note 5. 7. Trines and sextiles, as well as conjunctions of Uranus and Neptune especially, but also Pluto, are very often heralds of misfortune. I can already imagine a general outcry. What? Are we theorizing that there are many more negative aspects than positive ones in a human life? And I reply, have you only noticed now? Is it not true that for every person who wins the lottery, there are at least 1,000 who fall down the stairs, lose their jobs, discover their child is on drugs, find their spouse is cheating, or are struck by a serious illness? This is the pure and simple, albeit terrible, reality. For every happy event, there are at least 1,000 wretched ones. Even trines and sextiles very often travel in a bad direction. Take very strong account of semi-squares and sesqui-squares in transits. They have enormous importance, exactly like squares and oppositions. Do not neglect them, or you might miss much of a situation. According to my experience, however, semi-sextiles, sextiles and quincunxies have very little influence or none at all. The ascendant in the 10th house of a solar or lunar return almost always brings exceptionally positive things, as you can read in the relevant paragraph. Much more so than Jupiter conjunct the midheaven of a solar return. I cannot say why this is either, but it certainly is so, and you will be able to realize it for yourselves. However, and I will specify this better later, the advantage of Jupiter close to the midheaven of a solar return lies in the fact that it works solely in a positive way. Note 6.14. An ascendant in the 10th house, when accompanied by a simultaneous bad transit of Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto to the midheaven, in the 10th house, or in a dissonant aspect to the ascendant Sun or Moon, conjunctions included, produces notable damage, quite significant non-negligible harm. Note 7.15. On days when there are many simultaneous aspects referring to transits, obviously the originality of my method consists also in understanding the scales of importance with which one must search for future events, both positive and negative. We should expect truly special events and tune our observational antennas well, placing ourselves in a state of vigilant defense. Some of the most dramatic moments of a life occur when a dissonant transit of Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto to the natal Sun, ascendant midheaven, or Moon is added to an ascendant stellium Sun or Mars of the solar or lunar return in the 1st, 6th, or 12th house of the return. You cannot go wrong. Note 8.17. Everything that is already a potential is highlighted by transits and the solar or lunar reacher. If Tizio Legiondo, let's say, has a bad natal Uranus in the 8th house, when Uranus transits in opposition to that position, it is reasonable to expect serious economic crises. The positive effect of the 10th house of return may concern only a single event, and not necessarily a numerous series of positive facts. Read the relevant paragraph. We must never forget that the variables involved in explaining the evolution of a life are three: genetic information, the biological heritage transmitted through DNA, the astral determinant, and the social, economic, cultural, historical, and political conditions of the period and territory where one is born and lives. If Napoleon Bonaparte had been born on an African plateau in the year 1400, he would not have become emperor of the world. According to some biologists, a fourth variable exists, though for them it is the third, as they do not believe in astral influence, based on the random connection between neurons when a life begins. But the point is, how can one say that in a nature where everything seems to follow precise universal laws, there are random phenomena? And how can one claim that such phenomena are not, instead, determined by the position of the stars at the moment of birth? To attempt to time the events of a year intercepted by the solar return, a truly difficult exercise, it is wise to take into account lunar returns, as well as the transits of both slow and fast planets. For example, if a solar return heralds very negative events, look at the position of Mars during the year, primarily in its dissonant aspects with the Sun, ascendant, midheaven, and Moon. For years with good solar returns, look instead at the corresponding situation determined by the transits of Jupiter and Venus. Note 9. Many think that the description of transits relative to natal houses is the same as the positions of stars in return houses. However, this is not at all certain, as you will notice when reading the respective chapters. If the indications of transits and the solar or lunar return are in conflict, proceed as follows. According to my experience, if transits are very bad and threatening, but the solar return is not very incisive, neither good nor bad, neutral or not very fearsome, then the year cannot record dramatic events and we should not worry. If conversely transits are of little importance, almost neutral, and not at all fearsome, but the solar return is bad and heavy even, if only due to an ascendant in the first 6th or 12th house, then we must certainly expect a very insidious and negative year. Within what orb should transits be considered? There is no rigid rule. Everything depends on the slowness or speed of the aspecting planet. Fast stars like the Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, and Mars can usually act up to 5 degrees before and 5 degrees after the precise orb of the aspect. Transits of Jupiter and Saturn can generally be considered valid within 3 degrees of orb before and after. For Uranus and Neptune, the maximum to consider is a couple of degrees, though sometimes we see them act with wider orbs. This is due to the addition effect, when they manifest together with other transits of faster stars. For Pluto, which can stay on the same point for up to 10 years, we must consider 1 degree at most, except for the exceptions just mentioned. As for semi-squares and sesqui-squares, the orbs must be tightened to the maximum around 2 to 3 degrees for fast planets and 1 to 2 degrees for the others. Note 10. 4. Mars transits tend to anticipate in the sense that they manifest more upon entering the aspect than upon leaving. But this rule should not be considered absolute. Transits should be considered in some ways negative and positive at the same time, regardless of whether they express themselves through a square or a trine. To understand if a planetary passage will manifest positively or negatively, one must observe the solar return, which is truly an open book of exceptional predictive clarity. It is difficult for those who read solar returns and transits according to the method described in this volume to be very far off in their predictions. Remember that the 8th house often concerns imprisonment. Triple transits are much heavier than simple ones. A planet can pass over the conjunction with another star and proceed without ever turning back, in the geocentric view we have of the sky above us. Conversely, in some cases, it transits in direct motion a first time, then retrogrades a second time, and passes again, definitively in direct motion, a third time. Triple transits are far more important than others. Planetary transits, especially slow ones, through the houses, even empty ones, are of extreme relevance and offer us precious information. Read the relevant paragraphs in this book. For many planetary passages, it is very useful to ask the consultant what happened during the same transit in the previous cycle. For example, a passage of Jupiter in the 2nd house can bring both much money in and much money out. To make reliable predictions, it is useful to ask the subject what happened from this point of view when the same thing occurred 12 years earlier. One of the fundamental points, in my opinion, in interpreting a solar return is that minimum importance should be assigned to the aspects formed by the various planetary positions within the global economy of the solar return itself. Let me explain. Let's say Tizio has a beautiful Mars, due to the aspects it forms, in the 6th house of the solar return. That Mars will still be deadly and not at all or almost not at all influenced by the good aspects it forms with other stars in the return chart. In other words, if we assign 100 as a negative numerical value to Mars in the sixth, we might add +1 or 1 depending on whether it forms trines or squares. Therefore, one should not harbor illusions. Mars in the sixth, first, or 12th is terrible, regardless of whether it is harmonious or disharmonious. This also applies in reverse. We can bet that a solar return Venus in the second or eighth house will always be positive for our finances, regardless of whether it is well aspected or not. Any star located within 2.5 degrees, plus or minus of a cusp, dividing two houses will function in both houses. This applies to target solar returns, TSR, target lunar returns, TLR, transits and natal positions, note 11. If there is a stellium between the first and 12th houses, even of positive stars like Jupiter, Venus, and Mercury, this must be read exactly as if we had the ascendant in the 12th house. If there is a stellium in the 8th house, even of positive stars like Jupiter, Venus, and Mercury, this must be read exactly as if we had the ascendant in the 12th house. It is not possible to position Mars and Saturn in the same house of a solar return, regardless of which house it is, except for the 3rd and 9th houses. Otherwise, very serious damage may result. Note 12. Naples, April 23, 1997. Updated November 2020. Notes 1. My rules 1 and 2 in this chapter are the only astrological laws accepted by science, for reasons I have explained in many pages under the relative entry in my Nuovo Dizionario di Astrologia, New Dictionary of Astrology, 2nd edition, available on Amazon. On this subject, I developed specific software many years ago that I have now decided to no longer market. For the scholar, however, it might be interesting to understand how it was set up. You can download a free book on this at the following link. PDF link provided in original text. B. This is likely the most important focus of all my research and the opening of totally new paths in astrology. Many people, perhaps due to the problem of repression explained so well in psychology, persist in not seeing this reality. I would like to offer an example from many years ago that I believe remains one of the most illuminating. I was visited by a young man of good general culture with whom I had become almost friends over the years. He has the sun in the 6th house, and as such, in my astrological vision, he's primarily a Virgo. I told him that if he stayed in his city, he would soon have an ascendant in the 6th house, and I strongly advised against it. Hence the usual question, and what could happen to me with an AS in the 6th? I explained everything you read in Rule 4, but he was always skeptical. He did not leave, and a year later he returned to complain bitterly and almost verbally assault me because, according to him, the year had been disastrous, but for none of the reasons you predicted. In practice, his woman, whom he was deeply in love with, had left him, and he was living through hell on earth. It was useless for me to repeat phrases from my books like health problems across the board, organic and/or psychological. Nothing. He was as deaf as a post because he had filed all the previous information into a specific mental Excel sheet. Virgo is an Excel sheet, and scrolling through it, he didn't find the girl's name or the entry fear of death. Consequently, he felt cheated by me and punished me by not asking for further appointments, which I would not have given him anyway. As you can see, even a rule written with granite clarity like my Rule 4 is unreadable for many due to that old truth. There is none so deaf as those who will not hear, attempting to be even clearer than light. In recent years, on the first day of my active astrology courses, I have students find this writing on the computer screen. I wish to repeat something I have written in at least half of my books, but which my opponents pretend never to read. My school has 34 rules for house placement in solar returns, but if I were forced to indicate only 2 with a gun to my head, I would say A, if there is the Sun, Mars, or a stellium in houses 1, 6, or 12, or the ascendant in those houses, or a stellium in the 8th house, or what I call Rule 34, Mars and Saturn in the same house. And yet it is not possible to travel for the solar return. You will almost certainly have a very difficult year, 12 very hard months in every respect, for health, psychological health, great sorrows, emotional pain, and or problems in a broad sense. For example, if your partner leaves you for someone else, this is one of the cases mentioned above. B, if you find yourself in the conditions of point A, it is not certain that you will end up under a tram and lose your legs. But if you end up under a tram and lose your legs, you can bet you were in one of the conditions listed in point A. 4. Once I had the painful case of an employee who had turned to one of the many astrologers convinced they could change these 34 rules using their own perception. The poor man had been placed on redundancy pay, cassa integrazione, and the foolish astrologer advised him to spend his birthday in a place that put Jupiter in his second house. A few months later, the unfortunate man was fired entirely. Allow me a somewhat ironic digression. A few months ago, an American university professor wrote to me asking in which ancient book I had read this rule. I politely explained it was my discovery, and he quite rudely replied that it was impossible. The rule worked perfectly, so I must have read it in an ancient manuscript. Indeed, Jupiter tied to the midheaven also works in cases where someone ends up on the front pages of newspapers worldwide because perhaps they killed and ate their own grandmother. In that case, obviously, we would also have something involving rules 4 and 5, 7. Here, one must indeed be careful. However, over decades and in hundreds of examples, I believe I've clarified what is meant by this. If the subject holds a high-level position, for instance, an important political office or host in a successful TV show, then the risks connected to such an astral situation are indeed large. But if we refer to one of the millions in public administration where being fired is only theoretically possible, then in 19% of cases we can accept a solar return ascendant in the natal 10th house, even with simultaneous dissonant transits, if we obtain other advantages by doing so. Reread note 3.9. We are referring to the timing of events. In my book Il Grande Trattato di Astrologia, 2nd edition, out of roughly 800 pages, about 500 pages, citing from memory, are dedicated to demonstrating my method through hundreds of examples and charts of public figures, using the integrated reading of solar returns, followed by lunar returns and transits. I would be pleased if colleagues who disagree with my method could offer hundreds of examples to validate their contrary theses. Man, I wrote this many years ago. Today I confirm it all, but I have become much less generous regarding orbs, which I tend to tighten more and more. To be even clearer, this means 2 degrees 30 hours before or after a cusp. For example, if the cusp of the 6th house falls at 0 degrees Libra, which also means 30 degrees Virgo, if Mars is at 27 degrees 31 Virgo, being less than 2 degrees 30 degrees from the cusp, it will function in both the 5th and 6th houses. If it were at 27 degrees 29 Virgo, it would no longer be on the cusp and would concern only the fifth house. Rules 31 to 34 were already in my head when I wrote the first edition of this manual, but I preferred not to include them because I was still testing them thousands of times on many people, myself included. Rule 31 is so important that today I could not even study a good target solar return without this fundamental data. In my other books, I explained why 2.5 degrees and how I arrived at this value. In the early years of working with TSR, I was satisfied with simply suggesting a short move within Europe to shift Mars from the 12th house to the 11th, never the first. It worked, but it was like early attempts at language between primitive beings. Me, Tarzan Eugene. Only after decades could I grasp the beauty of an academic expert astrology through Rule 31. As I write in October 2020, I have been traveling for every lunar return for nearly 15 years, 13 times a year, plus the solar return. These are not just trips between Milan and Trieste, but intercontinental journeys to Alaska, Siberia, South Africa, Cuba, New York, and all over the world. I don't expect gratitude, but I did it for my thirst for knowledge and for the direct benefits for me and those close to me. To help you understand, I'll share one episode. About 2 years ago, to verify Rule 31 on my birth time, which I consider certain to the minute, I went to Oslo, then to a wonderful location in the far north of Norway, and then by a small plane to a tiny village even further north. I landed on a cold but beautiful winter morning. I made the mistake of thinking I could reach my base camp on foot. It was less than 2 kilometers, but on a road where drivers were practicing for a Grand Prix. There was no sidewalk, only meters of snow. Every few seconds, hearing a missile of a car coming, I had to jump into half a meter of snow, soaking my jeans to the knee. Finally, I reached the hotel and waited for the time of the return. Now came the difficult part. To test the return's efficiency, I had to move to a point on a small mountain 6 to 7 kilometers away where there was nothing, no houses, no shops, only forest. I had identified a tiny pond, about 10 meters wide on Google Earth. I needed a taxi, but I couldn't give the driver too many answers to his worried questions. I called a taxi and a young man, barely 18, picked me up. I showed him the pond circled in red on the map. He was shocked. "But we have to go up the mountain." I said, "That's fine." In less than 15 minutes, we were there. Now I had 2 problems, proving I was at that pond and convincing the boy to stay there with the engine off for 15 minutes. I climbed a 2-meter mound of ice to see and recognize the frozen pond. Convincing the boy was harder. He was clearly shaken, but he kept his cool. Finally, after checking my watch many times, I told him we could return. I asked him to take me to the airport later that evening. He agreed, but I never saw him again. I think I unintentionally gave him a small shock. That evening my plane broke down, and the crew and I spent 5 hours on a bus speeding through snowy fjords. This is the University of TSR and TLR. Once a birth time is corrected, you achieve excellence by using cusps, capturing 2 or 3 good cusps, while avoiding a bad one. Yeah. I also studied this for a long time before finalizing it. Like Rule 31, it is fundamental for studying TSR and TLR at a non-elementary level. My opponents, unable to win on technical grounds, prefer insults. Ciro Discepolo's active astrology is terrorism. By their logic, doctors who advise against smoking or for using protection are terrorists. In my books, there are many examples of the damage caused by failing to apply this rule. The damage goes beyond the house's direct meanings. Many years ago, a student of mine, not young but not old, had objective life difficulties and lack of money. She lived in a ruin in the countryside with 10 stray cats. She consulted me for her next birthday. She wanted to stay home, but I strongly advised against it because she would have Mars and Saturn in her 5th house. She insisted I can explain what they mean. My partner is terminally ill and will leave me soon. Also, my cats, part of my 5th house, will have to go because I've been evicted. I explained the meanings weren't just those, but I gave up when she said she simply had no money to travel. Unfortunately, what I feared happened. 6 months later, she was diagnosed with advanced bladder cancer. I have seen something nearly identical more than once. She was operated on, but later developed uterine cancer and passed away a few years later. I could give other examples of throat cancer with Mars and Saturn in the 2nd, or physical assaults with Mars and Saturn in the 7th. For those who want to understand, no further explanation is necessary. The possible rule, 35, this is what I've been studying all my life. The first thing that piqued my interest, but it hasn't become the 35th rule yet, because the number of confirmations is still too low. It is proven that in the space where we live, there are many rhythms, starting with biorhythms, but there are not only biorhythms marking the paths of plants, animals, and humans. For reasons that seem obvious to me, the fantastic book Supernature by Lyle Watson has not been reprinted in Italy for decades. In it, he reviews countless living clocks. Curiosity has always devoured me. It is the greatest gift I received at birth. When I discovered astrology in 1970 and began studying it for 10 hours a day, I looked for signals everywhere. My first subject of study was myself, aided by 3 deep analyses, 4 to 5 sessions a week over many years. After my 14-month military service, I realized I had been punished 3 times, a serious matter for me, as I followed rules strictly. Looking at the records, I realized I had been punished all 3 times on a Tuesday. This wasn't a rule yet, but an alarm went off. From then on, I noted every unpleasant event, deaths, trials, accidents. I soon established that between me and Tuesday, there was a very bad electric current. Conversely, Thursday generally brought the most positive realities. I tried to control for projections, but dates are dates. If my car was stolen on a Tuesday, suggestion had little to do with it. I initially thought this applied to everyone. Tuesday as Mars' day, Thursday as Jupiter's. I observed my girlfriend to see if she shared this pattern. To my surprise, after months of notes, I concluded that for her, the exact opposite was true. I expanded my research, but others gave different answers. Some feared leap years, others February, others the 18th of the month. When my daughters were born, I observed them too. Their bad day was Wednesday for both. I never found their good day. When my story with Daniela began in 2008, I discovered within weeks that her bad day was Friday and her good day was Wednesday. Daniela is a very concrete woman. She no longer does anything dangerous on Fridays and even schedules medical exams for Wednesdays. An important detail, my good Thursday used to have a tail that extended into Friday morning. Since living with Daniela, that positive tail has ceased to exist, perhaps because Friday is Daniela's worst day. This led to a hypothesis. If one person's positive or negative days can influence their partners, it would explain why I found no universal consistency among consultants. For now, I only have these family cases to support this. so I would never write it as a rule. I have invited students to investigate but haven't received feedback. The method is simple. Take people around 50 years old, mark every bad date, mourning, accidents, fines, separations, and every good date, and check the day of the week. But for now, this is not Rule 35.